University of Wisconsin. And then we will have a forest health webinar on the third Friday of June. And both of those will start at 9 o'clock. And more information is posted to the Maine Forest Service calendar.
Very good. Thank you, Don. I hope it's not too cold up there on the mountain. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to talk about wildfire prevention on woodlots. It's something that's near and dear to my heart. I do a lot of fire prevention for the Maine Forest Service, and also I'm a woodland owner, and have been. It's been in our family since the late 20s, so it's really something that I have a lot of passion for. So we'll go ahead and get started. And like I said, if you could mute your microphones and also just put any questions into the chat. I'll see if I can share my screen and we'll get rolling. All right, can everyone see that? I guess I'm only going to hear from Sherry. Sherry, can you see that all right?
Yes, I can see that. Looks fine.
Okay, thank you. We'll get rolling. So this is the topic of my presentation, wildfire prevention on woodlots, and there's my contact information, which Sherry is going to put in the chat either now and towards the end. Some of the topics we're going to cover today is the frequent causes of fires in Maine and the types of wildfires and fire behavior, wildfire prevention, fire planning, especially if you own a woodlot, but it also applies to homeowners, and of course, safety around wildfires. So let's do a little bit of background on this. We had a really busy fire year in 2020, almost 3 times the amount of fires and acreage were burned. But I just want to look back to last year, which was just about average with the number of fires and a little lower on the number of acres. You can see we had 651 fires reported, and then they burned about almost 400 acres. So far this year, we're kind of right in the middle of where we should be, or typically are rather. We've had 73 wildfires that have burned about 40 acres. But this is, we've had our spring fire season going on for 2 or 3 weeks here, and obviously had a lot of rain the last couple of days. So what are the most common causes of wildfires in Maine? I will say that over 92% of the fires are human caused and therefore preventable. So that's a good bit of information to know, that we don't have a lot of lightning strikes here or fires that aren't caused by people being careless. The number one cause, if you can look at that graph, I know the text is kind of small, are escaped debris burns. And these are the brush pile fires that you often see this time of year, that people have good intentions. They're trying to remove some of the downed limbs and brush from the winter and get them off the lawn, and they have good intentions, but they don't care for that fire properly. They don't put it out, or they're not there monitoring it, and it escapes. The second biggest cause typically in Maine is equipment caused fires. And that's a pretty broad range. Well, I have some pictures to show what that means, but it ranges from a small brush cutter, chainsaw, lawnmower, all the way up to logging equipment. And then of course we have campfires that are unattended and also escape and cause wildfires. So here's an example of a reasonably small sized brush pile fire. I took this photo in my yard a few years ago to show that you don't need a 6 or 8 foot high brush pile to have one of these fires. It's much better to keep it small, so it's easier to control and easier to put out if the wind picks up. Here's another example of a brush pile fire in a good area with good rocky soil right there, so it won't spread. And this occasionally happens. We have skidder fires in the woods where the equipment overheats and somehow ignites and causes a fire. We had this one last winter, and it was a timber harvester that ignited And fortunately, there was plenty of snow on the ground, so it didn't spread, but it did take a lot of effort to get that fire out once it gets going. We occasionally also have power line fires where trees fall on power lines and cause them to arc. And we try to get those taken care of as soon as we can, like all wildfires. One problem that we always have, and it's even worse when it's in a remote area, is unattended campfires. These campfires are generally for recreation, and once the people are done with them, they go to bed or drive off, and the fire just remains ignited. So it still is producing heat. It wasn't put out properly, and the next day, usually, or the day after, the wind comes up in the afternoon and it spreads the embers into some unburned fuel and it catches. So that's a good reminder to be careful and make sure your fire is completely out before you leave the area. So let's transition to the different types of fires that we have in Maine. In general, we have surface fires and occasional tree torching, and then rarely we have crown fires. This photo here is of a ranger working a hose on a surface fire that's going through a lot of slash, as you can see, probably in a softwood stand down east. Here's another example of a surface fire, and I believe this was a prescribed fire that we did a few years ago. The fire behavior is fairly low in intensity and severity, and it just consumes the surface fuels. Pretty easy to control if you're doing a prescribed burn. Another example of that. This one's a little more intense. And like I said, we do certainly have occasional softwood torching where the surface fire creeps along the ground and then comes into a softwood tree and just whoosh, it goes up and torches, and sometimes it sends embers off downwind, which can aid to the spread of the fire. Now, this is an old black and white photo from the 1947 fire, and this was taken in Arundel, and that's Route 1, which was the only north-south highway at the time. And they said some of these huge pine stands ignited and crowned out, and the flame lengths were up to 300 feet high. It's a rare to see that type of fire behavior in Maine. We call that extreme fire behavior, but it does happen occasionally, and it has happened. And it certainly could happen again. Here's another example of a crown fire taken at night, and I believe this was taken out in the western part of the United States. So I've got through about 18 of my slides, and I'd like to just take a short break and see if there's any questions that I can answer on what I've talked about so far. Sherry, do you see any questions in the chat? Okay, we're going to press on then. No problem.
Okay, there's no questions in the chat right at the moment.
That's fine. We're going to talk a little bit about wildfire prevention. We have our famous fire prevention mascot, Smokey Bear, on the left there, and that's a fairly recent drawing of him. He's looking pretty buff. He's been doing some working out and eating right. He's the country's longest public service campaign. He's going to be 77 years old, and very successful for educating children, especially, on how to prevent wildfires. But we do more than that with the Maine Forest Service. There's a picture of me taken a few years ago down in Booth Bay, talking to a homeowner after I had done a wildfire risk assessment on their property, trying to give them an idea of the likelihood of a wildfire near their structure. And there I am handing that person a brochure. And here's some of the community fire prevention programs that the Maine Forest Service is involved with. NFPA has the Firewise USA program, which we have 9 participating communities in Maine. One less spark, one less wildfire. It's not really a program, but we use that slogan sometimes just to get people to be careful with dragging chains from trailers that could sparkle on the road and start a fire, stuff like that. And then, of course, we have our online burn permit system in the bottom right, which you can reach by going to maineburnpermit.com. So here's another forest ranger that is conducting wildfire risk assessments. We have an app on our phones where we can go around the exterior of a home and look at about 28 or 30 different items, ranging from the type of building materials to the access to the closest water source, to the vegetation near the structures and stuff like that. And it gives it a rating on low, moderate, or high, whether it's likely to burn if a wildfire comes through. A lot of our knowledge about this preventing wildfires near structures comes from NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association. And they've developed this concept over the last 10, 15 years of different home ignition zones. I'm just going to touch on that a little bit here, but I have more information on that available if someone's interested, and they have a great website. If you just go to you just Google firewise.org, and they'll have stuff on that. But you can see that the red area closer to the house is more likely to have embers land there and start ignite the structure. And so more treatment is necessary closer to the house within that first 30 feet than further away. It's just kind of common sense. And here's another slide that shows how these home ignition zones overlap. So if you've got a neighbor that's kind of close to you on one side and there's a lot of softwood brush in there, usually kept there for privacy, that could potentially carry a structure fire from their house through the forest and over to your house. So you want to think about that. It's not always easy to mitigate hazards right near the boundary line, but there are certain things you can do. Here's another slide about tree spacing near structures. So if your structure, your home or camp on your woodlot is on near a steep slope, you're going to want to keep the softwood trees spaced a little bit further apart. So if there is a wildfire that creeps along the surface, it doesn't catch one of those softwood trees on fire, have it torch out, and then catch the next tree on fire, and then work its way towards your structure. So let's stop again and just see if there's any questions that we need to address in the chat room.
And there is a question that asks, what qualifications does a landowner need to conduct a prescribed burning? And what training or study would you recommend?
Okay, well, you can do small burns on your own property as long as you have the resources that are listed on the permit. You can get usually a handwritten permit from your local town fire warden. I'll just say small. I'm not going to say a certain size, but if you're going to be doing more than 5 acres or so, a prescribed burn, you need to probably get in touch with the Maine Forest Service and have a forest ranger kind of evaluate the property. And we do have several qualified burn bosses. And when I say qualified, they've had extensive training in prescribed fire, and it's all standardized across the country through the National Wildfire Coordinating Group. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but get in touch with us where you want to burn, and we'll see if we can provide some assistance and possibly some resources. Thank you.
Also, is there a mulch which is recommended for both residential and commercial use to reduce fire starts?
Yeah, we had some problems with that. I'm based out of Augusta here, and I know they've had a lot of mulch fires from people throwing cigarettes and stuff like that when it's dry. And they wanted to try to outlaw mulch in the city of Augusta. I don't know if they ever got that far. And the general recommendation is they've done studies on it, and some mulches are less likely to burn than others. I think the rubber-based mulch doesn't ignite as quickly as the bark-based mulch. But if you have a place that you can put little stones and non-combustible materials in there, you're much better off. I'm kind of a hypocrite. I have mulch around some of the trees in my house, but I never put mulch right up next to the foundation. That makes me nervous because that's where the embers are going to land if there's a nearby structure fire or a large wildfire. Thank you for the questions. We're going to keep moving on here. So fire prevention on woodlots, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about, and I've finished the background, and we're going to go through some slides here that cover these topics of how to monitor your forest and, you know, the discussion about do you restrict access? You know, that's a tough one because you don't want people in there who could start fires, but then if there is a fire, you want forest rangers or the local fire department to be able to get in. So that's kind of a tricky one there. We'll talk about sharing some of your stand type maps or trail maps with local fire officials or the Maine Forest Service, and maybe show where water can be drawn if there is a fire. And most importantly, you need to know which agency will respond if you have a wildfire. I don't want to talk too much about my woodlot in central Maine, but it is in a plantation and it does not have a fire department. It's contracted with a nearby town, but when I say nearby, it's probably going to be 45 minutes to an hour before they are able to get there. So the Maine Forest Service is the lead agency to respond to a wildfire or even a structure fire in plantations and unorganized townships. So you have to keep that in mind and factor that into how much risk are you going to take having a brush pile fire or a campfire on your property, on your woodlot. Something to think about. So a good idea. We talk about situational awareness in some of our incident command training, and it's basically they call it keeping your head on a swivel. You know, your eyes are always looking for clues of what's going on with the situation. So as you're walking your woodlot, or even you know, during hunting season when you're out there, look for signs of where someone has had an illegal campfire or where they might be able to get in. You know, you're always looking for that kind of stuff, so you'll know if a fire occurs. This is a part of our family woodlot, and it no longer looks like this. This is off of a pretty well-traveled logging road, and there used to be rocks there to keep trucks out, and we had to remove those for a timber harvest. And it's generally not a good idea to impede trucks because you're also impeding the forest ranger that needs to get in there to put the fire out. A much better idea is a gate or a chain, something safe, and share that key or that password or the combination with the Forest Service. I should add, though, most of us have a universal key with us, which is a set of bolt cutters. Here's a quick picture of some of the trails on my woodlot, and I would like to share this with the local fire department. So if there ever is a fire and on my property, I'm not around, they'll at least know that, yeah, they can get in there with an ATV or something to get water to the fire. So that's handy if you have that opportunity to share that with the local forest ranger or municipal fire department. And this is what I was talking about before, the situational awareness. This is in a gravel pit, so it's not really a bad spot, but you know, when you see something like that, you see a rock ring, and this fire could have been done in the winter with snowmobile people or something like that. But you want to make sure you disperse those rocks, because what does that look like if you're new to the area? That looks like, oh, I can camp here, someone else camped here. Maybe I can just have a fire here. So you don't want to encourage that. You want to keep up on that and disperse those rocks. Don't rake it all up so it doesn't look like a fire's ever been there. This is a little bit off on a tangent, but I wanted to share just a couple slides from a presentation that one of our rangers, Zach Monroe, did for our regional compact meeting this winter. He talked about this smoldering fire that was from an unattended illegal campfire up near Bean Pond in central Maine. And they couldn't find the location of the fire. Everyone just kept smelling smoke occasionally, and we were going through a dry period last August, I think, and they wanted to figure out where this fire was. So he's the lead person on our drone committee, and so he took a drone out there that had infrared on it, and they they scanned over the same area. Here you can see that, and if you look right in the center there, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but right in the center there's a white spot. Well, that is the heat signature from that small campfire that wasn't doing much at that time, but it could have easily spread if the wind picked up, and it could have threatened structures and burned a lot of forest land. So kind of a neat thing, but the point is, you know, have your situational awareness, know what's going on. If you smell smoke, call the Forest Service or the local fire department, do some investigating, try to find out where that's coming from. Another thing we like to do in terms of fire prevention is education. You know, we have these signs available in limited quantities, but if you have problems with illegal campfires on your woodlot or near your woodlot, get in touch with us and we'll try to get a few signs out there. We don't like to just mail them out. We'd rather have a ranger come out and kind of see the situation, get some boots on the ground and see, and maybe they can offer some suggestions, and maybe they'll include it in their patrol so they can kind of check on things, keep an eye on things if you're having problems. Right along with fire prevention is knowing what the daily fire danger report is. We've had this system up and going for about 2 weeks now, and we've done some updates on it, and it's getting to be pretty accurate. We've got over 30 weather stations throughout the state, and we get that data from the weather stations and combine it with the National Weather Service forecast for the day, and put a rating on the likelihood. Actually, the rating is on how difficult it would be to contain the fire. So you can see this is an older screenshot, but the central part of Maine is designated as high fire danger that day. So in general, it would be difficult to get a burn permit on a high fire danger day. You certainly won't get one through our online burn permit system, but you can see that there's also some very high fire danger down in the southeast portion of York County. So I'll take a quick break and see if there's any questions in the chat room.
No questions right now, Ken?
Okay, we're pressing on. We're about halfway through. I appreciate your attention, and hopefully we'll have some more questions and some discussion at the end. We're going to transition to what I call thinking like a firefighter. It's kind of easy for rangers to do that, especially they've been on for a number of years. We get that mindset of, you know, always knowing which way the wind's blowing, knowing the daily fire danger rating, stuff like that. But, you know, as a woodlot owner, you could do some of this stuff. It's not that hard to identify ignition sources. And I have some photos of some typical ones and some unusual ignition sources as well. You certainly know where the water sources are, either on your property or nearby. And then hazardous mitigation, that's a pretty fancy word for keeping the brush cut near your structures and near your roadways. And creating, maintaining fire breaks. We'll talk about that a little bit. And maintaining access, providing keys to local fire responders, first responders, and even setting up a safety zone. So here's some ignition sources. Some people that have older ATVs, they may alter the exhaust and they open it up to, for some reason, get the loud noise, I guess, or it just rusts out. But that type of exhaust is illegal because it's more likely to allow sparks to come out. A newer ATV or side-by-side is by law has to come with a U.S. Forest Service certified spark arrestor. So rangers can inspect on that, and they do need to be maintained. You have to take the carbon out of them once in a while, but it takes a lot of driving before they get filled up. So here's an unusual ignition source. I investigated this fire about 10 or 15 years ago, and again, someone had good intentions. They had this old truck in their yard that was no longer legal to drive on the road, but they used it to move leaves from one side of the property to the other. And when they backed it in to get rid of the leaves, the hot exhaust caught the whole leaf pile on fire. burnt the truck and then spread it into the woods. So it's kind of an unusual source and hard to prevent, but common sense would say, you know, if you knew that the fire danger rating was moderate or high that day, and you're feeling that vegetation crunch under your feet as you're walking through the woods, then maybe it's not a good idea to use equipment in the woods that day, or at least this type of equipment. And this is, of course, is in support of the agricultural burns that occur in Maine, and we get a fair amount of those. I don't know if they use this type of equipment. I just found this photo online, but certainly down east, there's a lot of blueberry fields that still do burning. And I don't want to give them a bad rap. That's part of their living, and I certainly love eating Maine blueberries, but they do have to be careful when they're doing the burning. And if you have a woodlot near one of these fields, then you maybe during the springtime when they're burning, you might want to check things occasionally on the dry and windy days to make sure there's no what we call slop over onto your property. Same thing with railroads. We do a lot of railroad inspections, and we check the distance that the vegetation has been maintained to prevent wildfires from either sparks from the exhaust of the diesel locomotives or from faulty brakes. But in these two photos, there have been fires near railroads. And I don't want to give them a bad rap either. Most of them maintain their railroads very well. But again, if you have a woodlot within a couple hundred feet of a railroad, you want to pay close attention to how it's maintained. And this one is a more common occurrence than I would like to admit. Rangers get called to a lot of these complaints of people burning trash and prohibited items. Burn barrels were outlawed about 30 years ago. You can still use them to burn brush, but you would need a burn permit, of course. But, you know, the typical summer outdoor barbecue that the fire is just left going and the people are off sleeping or have left the area, that can be very dangerous. So if you have any of those near your woodlot, you want to keep an eye on that as well. And this one, of course, you can the shot of the little boy on the right, that's from the internet. But you know, we do get a certain percentage of the fires in Maine are caused by children playing with matches. And I wanted to bring that up as a reminder that next week, the governor has signed a proclamation to make it Wildfire Awareness Week between April 17th and the 23rd. And we're doing a lot of awareness events to try to get people to realize that we have a lot of fires in the spring. If you're not from the area, you might think that our fires only occur in late summer and when it gets dry in August and in early September, but we have a lot of fires in the spring. Our lowest relative humidity recordings are generally this time of year, and we did some research on the data because Maine Forest Rangers investigate every wildfire in the state and assign a cause to it. And we also look at the environmental conditions, and we found out that there was a spike in wildfires during the third week of April rather. So that's why we have Wildfire Awareness Week. And if you do have young children that are out of school and out, we certainly encourage them to play outdoors and enjoy being outside, but just remind them that they should never play with matches or a lighter. It could be very dangerous. So let's transition to fire breaks and water sources. If this was a classroom, I might say, does that look like you could put out a forest fire with that little trickle of water there? And the answer is you can. At least forest rangers can. We're trained. We can dam up that brook and get it to look like this in a few minutes. We need about 8 or 10 inches, maybe a foot worth of water, and it needs to come in steadily from above, and we can run our portable pumps and get some water on the fire and try to get that out. As you're looking at your woodlot, be aware of brooks and streams and if they're intermittent or not, which means, you know, they may dry up in the summer. We certainly have had some droughts, especially in 2020, that really restricted the amount of water available to fight fires. And here's something else you have to think about is draft height. If this is the only location you can get water to put out a fire near your woodlot, is the local fire department or the Maine Forest Service going to be able to draft 8 or 10 feet up from that to get the water they need? And I should add that this is kind of near my woodlot, and this is a rare occurrence. This is a spring runoff. By the time August rolls around, this is a trickle. It's probably not even a foot deep by then, but still good to know where it is. And maybe some of you have heard of dry hydrants. These are hydrants that are put in near ponds and water sources. Some are along rivers, and they allow the fire department to draw water out of the pond most any time of the year. They can even do it in the winter if there's a big structure fire. And then we have these red, you can see there's a red Fulda tank there in the right photo that we fill up and then allow the water tender to come get water from that tank and take it to the fire. I wonder also how many people have farm ponds near their woodlot. And if you need any more information on that, you can contact the NRCS at the website above. So let's take another short break. Any questions in the chat room that I can help with?
None right now, Ken.
So hazardous mitigation, I told you what that involves. That's brush chipping, and controlled burns. And that's generally something that I do a lot of my woodlot and at home and for work. And I'm sort of like most people. If I'm on my woodlot trying to enjoy relaxing there, I don't want to spend all day cutting brush. But if you don't do a little bit each year, it gets to be overwhelming. I'm sure people would agree to that. So the idea is to do a little bit each year. You know, if you have a lot of brush near your structure, if you've got a camp on your woodlot, you want to try to minimize that brush within 30 feet. And it doesn't mean you have to clear everything out, but kind of concentrate on your softwood trees because they have the resins in the bark, and the needles are much more likely to ignite than on a hardwood. But you can still keep a few trees, just make sure that they're not what we call contiguous. You don't want a line of softwood trees coming from the forest directly to your back of your structure, for example. So you want to break them up into little pockets of vegetation. So if there is a surface fire, it doesn't spread easily. You can also kind of create or widen existing fire breaks. So this is just a small access road, but this is a community in southern Maine that they had a work day, and they got maybe 6 or 7 people to volunteer to cut back some of the brush, and then they followed it up later with a chipper that they had available to get rid of that brush and widen their access road, which decreases the likelihood of the fire jumping and also improve safety for driving and visibility. Good to keep on that every year or so. And we had a question earlier about prescribed fire. You can see there's probably 6 or 8 trained firefighters in the Nomex fire resistant clothing, and they've got an engine there, and they're just making sure that this prescribed fire, this controlled burn, does not get into the woods on the left-hand side of the screen. So before they even put any fire down on this, they came through with some type of machinery and just cut all the vegetation. So where they're standing and where that truck's parking, nothing's going to burn. So there is a lot of preparation that goes into doing prescribed fires. And Maine Forest Service has a couple rangers on a new prescribed fire council that's getting all the people that do this type of burns to meet together quarterly and discuss how they can do this more often. It's a good program, and done safely and correctly, it can eliminate or reduce the likelihood of a wildfire. So last month, I had the privilege of going back to my alma mater, the University of Maine, and talking to some students for an hour or so about incorporating fire prevention plan into their forest management plans. And this was a forest management class. They were writing plans, and I certainly didn't expect them to do a 10-page dissertation on fire within their forest management plan, but we ended up kind of coming to a compromise of maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs that covered some of the highlights of this talk. And one thing you need to do is look at these 6 or 7 items. You need to talk, you could just have these mentioned just to get thinking about it. If you're doing forest management, you need to make sure there's access for firefighters in the event of a fire. And, you know, like I said, what time is a fire likely to occur? It's not just in the summer. It could be in the spring or in the fall. You need to look at topography, how the lay of the land. Fire tends to travel faster if it's burning upslope. But most fires in Maine are generally spread by the wind. The wind is the biggest cause of pushing fires. And if you've got a lot of wind and it pushes fire, you can get hundreds of acres burning in a day. We talked a little bit already about location of ignition sources. Hopefully I gave you some ideas to keep your situational awareness on that. And location of volatile forest fuels. That's your softwoods. If you've got a softwood stand and it has a lot of what we call ladder fuels, and I'm talking with my hands here, you can't see it, but these are the low softwood branches that hang near the surface. If you have a surface fire, they would allow the branches to ignite and then that tree to torch, which could then spread to other trees. So obviously you want to think about protecting structures. And not just structures, you could have other valuable natural resources. It could be a Christmas tree plantation, could be something that involves tourism, a camping area, something like that. So there's a lot to protect in our forests. I didn't mention this before, but you also want to make sure that the local fire authorities know the location of the landing so they can have a staging area. This was taken on my woodlot a few years ago. It is a tree farm. And that is, you can just barely see the moose that was standing there one morning. This photo was actually taken in New Hampshire last year. They had a pretty big fire in the mountains, and it shows an example of how that fire preheats as it burns upslope and increases the fire intensity and rate of spread. So if you have a lot of topography on your woodlot, you may need more than 30 feet of clearing near your structures. You may have to put that up to 50 feet. And of course, the prevailing wind direction, where my camp is, it's usually coming out of the west. So I know that if a fire starts near my camp, if it's to the west, it may spread towards it. If it's beyond that, it's not going to be as much of a concern for the camp itself, but it could get onto the next woodlot. I've mentioned this a few times. The softwood stands probably more likely to carry a crown fire than a hardwood stand. If you get a mixed stand, it could be just enough. But if you have property this is just a little peninsula, this photo obviously was taken from the air. If you can kind of manage your softwood away from your values at risk, your structures and high value timber, that would help you in the event of a fire. Protecting structures. I took this picture in Bethel one spring. They had a fire there, and fortunately, this log cabin was being built. It wasn't quite lived in yet, and they had cleared the lot to build the structure. So the fire just went to the edge, and as soon as it got to that mineral soil, it was easy to put out. So the structure really didn't get burned. But since then, I'm sure the grass has grown back, and I would really recommend that people manage the vegetation within 30 feet of their structures. So we're getting towards the end here, folks, and I appreciate your attention. And we got a couple more slides, and then we'll see if anyone wants to discuss anything, have any further questions. Is there any questions right now, Sherry?
There's a question. What are your thoughts about using shaded fuel breaks work to slow the spread of wildfire on Maine woodlots?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, and I think that makes sense to people. You know, you don't want a big, what we would call as a wildland firefighter, you don't want a dozer line going across your property. We really love the look of the woods and the feel and the smell of the woods here in Maine. That's why we live here. So if you don't want to look at a mineral soil fire break, you could have a shaded fuel break, which you tend to manage the vegetation on the ground and leave the trees to shade and therefore not allow the afternoon sun to dry the surface as much, if that makes sense. But thank you for that question. Very good. So let's talk about safety around wildfires. I know a lot of woodlot owners that do brush burns on their property occasionally, and you're listening to one now. I had a small brush pile fire last week on my property to clean up some brush that I had cut last fall. The number one recommendation is follow all the open burning laws. If you do get an online burn permit or even a handwritten permit, you are required by law to follow all the restrictions listed on that permit. And that could range from the type of tools to the amount of people to the how many gallons of water, and most importantly, the allowable burn times. Some permits don't allow burning till the evening after 5 p.m. when there's more local firefighters available to respond to a wildfire, and when the relative humidity increases and the winds tend to die down. So report any violations of open burning laws being broke. So, I don't know if that's good English. Violations of open burning laws. So if your neighbor or the next woodlot over is constantly burning stuff that doesn't smell like wood, then contact the Forest Service. We'll go check it out. If a fire occurs, call 911. And just keep in mind that as wildland firefighters, we are not trained to fight firefighters greater than 4 feet high with hand tools and backpack tanks. So we are trained to back off if that fire is more than 4 feet high. That's because they've done studies and it's very difficult to put out a fire that's higher than that, and you're just on foot and you only have 5 gallons on your back. You're going to need bigger equipment for that. And so we strongly recommend that people don't try to fight wildfires themselves. Get the authorities there that have been trained and have the proper safety equipment and tools to put it out. So a safety zone, I mentioned that earlier. That could be just a piece of ledge, or it could be an old gravel pit. And this is the place that you would go in a last resort if you had a fire near your property. So just keep that in mind.
I think that this filter is super fun.
And like I said before, if you are conducting a brush pile burn, make sure you follow all the rules and keep plenty of water. The slide on my left is at my camp, and I don't have a well there, but I've got 6 rain barrels. And if I ever have a fire, I've got a sort of a fighting chance if it's a small fire. And I do grow Christmas trees there, so I want to make sure those are okay, as well as the camp and my friend the moose. So here's some of the take-home message as we wrap this up. Obey all the open burning laws. If you need a burn permit, you're welcome to go to our online burn permit system. We're on the verge of making some improvements to that system to make it easier for the user and easier for the town fire wardens and the Maine Forest Service. You can get there by going to maineburnpermit.com. And we also suggest that if you're a woodlot owner or even just a homeowner, that you monitor the fire danger report. That can be accessed by going to mainefireweather.org. And if you have the opportunity, you're a forester or you're going to have a forest management plan done on your woodlot, ask them about putting a few paragraphs in there about a fire plan. And if you have any questions on that, the local forest ranger can help with that. And I'm going to ask that Sherry also put my contact information in the chat room, my phone number and email, please. We just developed what we call fire size up cards. And if you want one of those, mention that in the chat room with your email, and we'll see if we can get one to you. It's a pocket-sized card that has all this information on it. And hopefully, after listening to this presentation, you have an idea what some of this stuff means. I talked about the types of fire, the fuel types, the weather, resources needed, and obviously structures threatened. And again, I want to emphasize, never try to fight a wildfire alone. Call 911 if you have a fire that escapes and becomes out of control. And we had a problem with this a couple years ago. You really don't need to be using any kind of fuel to start your fire. If you're going to have a brush pile fire, do not pour gas on it or even charcoal lighter fluid. It's perfectly legal to get some paper and start the fire small and let it build up. So that wraps up my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if there's any questions or anyone wants to say hello or have a discussion.
Kent, there is a question that asks, is there anything that can be done legally to reduce the risk from a neighbor's property? From a neighboring property?
Yes, we get that question a lot, and there is a law to do with nuisance, smoke nuisance from campfires and from fires. So if your neighbor is upwind of you and is constantly burning, they may be burning legally, they may have a permit, but if that smoke becomes a nuisance and gets into your home and causes breathing problems, example for elderly people, then they will be required to put that fire out. Other than that, Maine is not like California and some of the western states where we have mandatory brush clearing laws. All the recommendations we make for clearing brush are certainly just recommendations. So we'll do the best we can to try to alleviate the risk, but your best option is to keep softwood trees away from your structures and kind of keep an eye on things, and let us know if they're burning prohibited materials or the fire's unattended.
Another question is, have you encountered a portable fire pump system with self-priming gas generator and pump with 125 gallon per minute capacity?
Wow, someone's done some homework. No, that sounds good. I don't generally get too much into the specifications of the wildland fire equipment. I know I administer the volunteer fire assistance program, and on occasion we have fire departments that are getting what they call slip-on tanks for side-by-sides, and they may only hold 50 or 60 gallons, but they have small portable pumps that are very good and lightweight, so they can get a small amount of water to fire in a remote location. So maybe we'll have you get in touch with a local forest ranger if you have specific questions about that. Thank you. Well, any other questions? Because we can, otherwise this is time to wrap this up and go out and enjoy some of that sunshine today. Anything else, Sherry?
Someone is typing if you want to wait just a minute.
Sure.
Oh, it was just a comment. Said, thanks, Kent. Good presentation.
Okay, appreciate it. Well, thank you again for joining this Forestry Friday seminar, and hopefully you'll be able to check in for the upcoming ones that Dawn talked about. Thank you for your attention and for your good questions, and I hope that you have a enjoyable and safe holiday weekend. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.